President Trump signed an executive order in May aimed at limiting the broad legal protections enjoyed by social media companies. That order came 2 days after Twitter fact-checked 2 of his tweets. For context and perspective on this, Carrie Saldo spoke with Joshua Braun, UMass Amherst Associate Professor of Journalism.
Trump and others in his orbit have sort of floated this idea that the folks behind social media platforms are a bunch of kind of coastal elites exercising partisan bias by censoring their views. And it's worth recognizing that this is in many ways kind of an extension of a very old strategy among media activists that dates back to the post-war years of the 20th century. So it's not unique to conservatives, but it's certainly been used most effectively by them. So it's hard for a law school dean or a billionaire to appeal to the sense of alienation among working class voters. And drumming up the idea that they're sort of being blacklisted by mainstream media is one way to say, look at how marginalized I am. So and I'm drawing here, I should say, on historian Nicole Hemmer's brilliant book, Messengers of the Right, which gets really deep into this if anybody kind of wants to look at that context. But basically, kind of right-wing broadcaster Clarence Mannion is one example. He was complaining in the mid-1950s, which are kind of arguably the golden years of politically neutral professional journalism. And he's complaining back then about the liberal media. And during the late 60s and early 70s, you had the formation of conservative media watchdog groups that were kind of aimed at sparking writing campaigns from conservative audiences and weaponizing the fairness doctrine complaints, to paint the news media as biased. So in some cases, the Nixon administration at the time was even effectively kind of colluding with them on projects like reducing support for public broadcasting. But the fairness doctrine was kind of a double-edged sword. So it could be turned against the mainstream media by conservative activists, but it also kind of constrained the reach of partisan media outlets back when television, especially when it relied on kind of scarce bandwidth resources that were controlled by the major broadcast networks. So if you kind of fast forward to today, you have a combination of deregulation that allows for, players like Clear Channel basically to, dominate radio stations across the country. So you have a combination of kind of deregulation and also, the getting rid of the fairness doctrine and technological changes that kind of make more channels available. And these things have kind of led to massive conservative media empires. So Fox News regularly tops the ratings, as you well know. Some studies of political talk radio have shown that over 90% of programming is conservative. There's a Harvard study recently that demonstrated that Breitbart dominated the online news diet of conservative social media users and had an agenda-setting effect during the 2016 election on the stories covered by nonpartisan outlets. So, and you also have audits of nonpartisan outlets like NPR, which conservative activists like to beat up on as being kind of a closet liberal outlet. And those tend to show that right-wing sources receive more airtime than their liberal counterparts. So kind of in short, conservative media activists have been arguing for 70 years or so that the mainstream media hold a liberal bias. But even if you grant that there have been times in that span when they made some valid points, it's really difficult to look at today's media landscape, dominated as it is by right-wing media juggernauts, and suggest that the media marginalize conservative views. So I have no great love for social media platforms, as you well know. But it's hard not to think of the critiques of Twitter and other platforms that are kind of emanating from the White House right now. It's hard to look at those as not being just kind of a way of pivoting a very old and well-rehearsed argument that voters tend to understand in a way that kind of scores points against a new set of actors. So that's a little bit of historical context.
No, it's fantastic. And also, as we're talking about these issues, kind of 2 things pop to mind, right? There's this idea of fact-checking, but also censorship, and how I think as I look at it more broadly, the president and others sometimes tend to conflate those 2. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about, you're a journalism professor, how you teach fact-checking and define fact-checking, and then I'll follow up with a different question.
Yeah, so fact-checking, so it's interesting because you can think of fact-checking in a few different ways, right? There's the idea of just the fact checking goes into news stories, and for a while, it was controversial. When the president or another public figure says something, that's newsworthy, right? And there's the argument that, well, you should report it, or you should balance it with another quote and let sort of readers decide what's true. But of course, there have been a series of controversies about, like, well, that's not enough. If the reporter behind the story knows that sort of one quote is misleading and the other is not, or that a particular statement doesn't line up with the facts, that they should just be able to say so right there in the story, right? So there's that idea of sort of fact checking, and including the factual, including sort of what kind of you can tell objectively about the facts that may be being misstated or warped in different ways in a quote. And there's also a discipline of fact checking that's kind of grown up in journalism. So you have organizations or initiatives like PolitiFact and others whose raison d'etre is basically to go and provide context and fact checks and sort of rate the truth or falsehood of different statements. And so you see, these are designed to be shareable on social media. I'm sure people have seen these sorts of fact checks. They're also kind of, they'll add metadata to them to sort of make it so that they're more easily sort of incorporated into search results. And this idea that you can basically be able to share a fact check as a media object online, and that this was also, kind of a growing style of journalism, in the same way that data journalism or other kinds of kind of new disciplines in journalism are growing up.
Well, what then happens when we hear the president talking about his fact checking in the same sentence as this idea that he's being censored in some way because someone or some entity is attempting to, what they see is, correct the record?
I think that's an important distinction to make, and I apologize if that got lost a little bit there, which is, adding context to something, which is arguably what you saw on Twitter, where, they're providing links to other information, and they're not actually removing the tweet. And even in the case of subsequent tweets that they decided to hide, there was still a way to see what the president was saying. You could just, click the sort of reveal button, and it would show you the tweet that the disclaimer had gone over top of. But in the first case, that initiated the president's complaints, the tweet was still there and visible in its entirety. It's just that there were a few links attached to it that you could go to if you wanted to know more. So I mean, in that sense, it's sort of, it's adding context. It's not even necessarily saying that he's incorrect. It's just saying, like, here's what you should also check out to sort of better contextualize this. So there's a distinction between, like, adding context, fact checking, and censorship that I think is the lines there are intentionally being blurred in an attempt at gaining political advantage.
Because there have certainly been people in recent weeks who have gone and suggested even further that the tweet not just be fact checked but be completely removed. And
right.
Some people argue that that's censorship. But when you look at this issue, who do you think is responsible for moderating these public platforms? Is it Facebook, Twitter? Or should it be the individual?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and so there's a number of kind of layers to it. One is, if you look at fact checking in journalism, I mean, a lot of these sort of new fact checking organizations or initiatives have had growing pains. So even when you look at a place where where you could say that fact checking is sort of the business of the organization, it becomes difficult because there's questions about, like, sort of what happens when should some statements be fact checked and not others? How do you decide who those belong to, or what statements are worth fact checking? Some organizations have kind of gotten into difficult waters. They attempted to fact check things that ultimately turned out to be matters of opinion, right? Or when it looked like they were fact checking more of like one individual than another, and like there were charges of bias or unfairness there. So even in organizations where this is their bread and butter, it can be a really complicated matter. And on the matter of sort of what should social media platforms do, you enter into a whole other level of difficulty. There is kind of a fundamental issue here about whether or not we want sort of private companies to be, whether we as users or we as a public want to outsource decisions about kind of how to moderate democratic speech and the public discourse, whether those are tasks that can really be outsourced to these private companies. And it certainly behooves them to sort of to say that, oh, we'll take care of it for you as a sort of service. But fundamentally, it seems like it should be the public that is, or the government, or some publicly accountable entity, and not a private corporation, is making decisions about what should be seen and what shouldn't be. So there is a very fraught conversation around moderation and sort of who should be doing it, what sort of public accountability should exist on private platforms. And I think one of the problems with this is that these are conversations that really need to be had, and the way in which the White House is sort of is invoking them, or the way in which they hope to resolve them by basically turning this into kind of a partisan conversation, or sort of a process that likely to have an extremely partisan outcome, is sort of it's short-circuiting what is a very necessary public debate.